not fundamentally egalitarian after all. The relationship of political correctness to the egalitarian impulse, the desire for equality, is interesting. So much of PC rhetoric concerns equality that it superficially seems as if equality of distribution of goods is the goal of political correctness. Yet this cannot be correct, since in practice PC imposes group preferences and inverts, but does not abolish, inequality. It seems that even a situation of near monopoly allocation of goods is compatible with the system of PC, indeed, celebrated by PC, so long as the monopoly is one of favored groups. Equality is not, therefore, the deepest impulse for political correctness. What is deepest in political correctness is moral opposition to, and the desire therefore to subvert and invert, the existing or historical state of affairs brought about by individual agency and spontaneous or natural causes. Whatever state of affairs existed in the past or currently exists in the absence of an abstract system of allocation is regarded by PC as intrinsically unjust on principle, and without the need for evidence of injustice. So, actual, real-world equality of outcome is a matter of near indifference to political correctness, except as evidence of the need for PC systems of allocation. Political correctness merely uses egalitarianism instrumentally as a way of generating policies, but egalitarianism is not really necessary, because policies are primarily oppositional, subversive, or inversional. In other words, PC looks at the human social world as it is and has been, that is to say, a world of multiple causal processes and without any overall master system of allocation, and regards this situation as necessarily unjust, ultimately because of intrinsic human selfishness. Human selfishness will always affect human choice. Choice will always therefore lead to injustice, and therefore injustice will exist so long as human choice is allowed. Equality is not necessary to political correctness, but inequality has the advantage of being amenable to definitions, measurements, monitoring, and being made the basis of bureaucratic procedure. But indeed any argument is suitable as a basis for PC to attack any existing state of affairs which relies on individual choice, free will. The dissatisfaction, actual, inferred, or imputed, of a just single symbolic person or one obscure victim group is enough to trigger wholesale change, just so long as this dissatisfaction can somehow be linked to the introduction of a system of abstract altruistic allocation. The destruction of human agency. For political correctness, happiness is not an empirical consequence of PC policies. Rather, happiness is the moral duty of individuals living under PC. Happiness is the state of virtuous humans when PC allocative policies are operating. Ultimately, for political correctness, happiness is abstract. Indeed, given that PC is totalitarian and coercive, this is necessarily the case. People are happy under a system of political correctness precisely because the system tells them they are happy, and expressions of misery are not tolerated. The masses are informed by PC that they want exactly what PC is giving them: multiculturalism, group preferences, moral inversion, hideous art, cultural self-hatred, xenophilia, the whole lot. And they are not allowed to contradict this message, or else they will be identified, isolated, and labeled as evil by the government and mass media, and will be left to take the consequences. At an individual level, the goal is not just to try to be happy about a PC situation, but to actually be happy. And the purest, most idealistic elite PC intellectual ruler really is happy under PC, abstractly happy, naturally. Happy regardless of whatever actually happens to him or anyone else. The phenomenon is familiar from Orwell's 1984. Uniquely, in this situation, a PC intellectual is allowed to be happy because this happiness is uncontaminated by selfishness. He is allowed to be happy in his despair because freed from guilt. So PC requires willing submission of the individual to abstract principles of allocation, especially when, as an individual, he is made emotionally, not abstractly, unhappy by the operation of such abstract principles. The tendency of PC is as follows: to identify and overcome all possible human freedoms and choices in relation to the allocation of goods, thus to replace the intrinsically selfish choice of individual autonomous humans with abstract systems of altruism. This may sound an extreme formulation of politically correctness, but it is literally true. Political correctness instrumentally uses human impulses, such as aspirations for justice or equality or happiness, to attack any and every social situation which currently lacks a system of abstract altruistic allocation. Effectiveness is irrelevant. For political correctness, abstract and altruistic allocation is intrinsically superior to human agency. It is therefore morally necessary to replace individual freedom with systemic coercion regardless of the consequences. Pragmatic measures of goods. The big problem for PC, in a system where human agency is intrinsically wicked, is to determine, or somehow just decide, what distribution of goods counts as altruistic. Clearly this question has no ultimate answer, since PC denies the validity of both reason and experience, as well as the possibility of divine revelation. Instead, there are a series of pragmatic answers to what counts as altruistic. But all of these answers bear the mark of human choice, so none of these answers are truly impartial abstractions. The principle of subversion and inversion of whatever is individual, spontaneous, and natural therefore serves as a rule of thumb to identify problems and to generate aims for the solutions. However, these aims are inexplicit because so obviously absurd. Hence the need for camouflage with false but asserted goals of such as being more egalitarian, humanitarian, compassionate, efficient. Anything will suffice. How does inversion operate? Simple. If men spontaneously tend to become leaders, then in an allocative system should favor women. If humans are naturally heterosexual, then allocative systems should favor any preference except heterosexuality. If a particular group rules and another is ruled, then the allocative system should invert the existing hierarchy. Being merely subversive and crudely inversional, the positive policies of political correctness are therefore arbitrary, changeable over time, generating a stream of stimulating novelties for the jaded bureaucratic palate. The evaluation of PC policies in terms of human happiness, suffering, income, or any other principle is again variable, and often PC policies will make things worse from any commonsensical and experiential perspective. But none of that matters, since the politically correct solution is always intrinsically superior insofar as it removes the scope or possibility of individual selfishness. The solution to any undeniable problems caused by PC is always more of the same. Residual problems are framed as insufficient PC, or covert resistance to PC from reactionaries. Always, everywhere PC aims at the removal of individual freedom and choice, the reversal of whatever is spontaneous, natural or historic, the inversion of what is, since individual selfishness, the ultimate PC evil, is intrinsic and will shape all uncoerced actuality. PC Utopia. The pure and idealistic politically correct elite intellectual aspires, as his highest goal in life, to create a perfect and autonomous mechanism for devising altruistic principles, then implementing them on all humans. Having created this mechanism for the imposition of abstract altruism, his own fate is a matter of indifference. The PC elite intellectual might step back and watch, might be rewarded, or might be destroyed, but the allocation machine, once built, will just keep running. Just keep on compelling wicked individual humans to do that which is abstractly just. A living death, a thought prison for all of society, a prison in which the ultimate PC human wickedness, i.e. selfishness, is impossible because every single human decision related to the allocation of the goods of life has been subordinated into a system of abstract altruism. This is the covert utopian dream of the politically correct. PC fundamentally about atomic individuals' atomic acts. In trying to get to the bottom of political correctness, it is necessary to discard as inessential some of its most prominent features. One of these prominent features of PC that is not really fundamental are group preferences, those affirmative action policies that identify a favored group and award them preferential treatment under the rationale of social justice. This is perhaps the most obvious and destructive aspect of PC, yet it is merely a transitional stage. If PC became more powerful and succeeded in imposing mandatory abstract altruistic systems on acts of allocations of goods, then group preferences would swiftly be abolished. In PC utopia, all groups would be dissolved, all humans would be treated as atomic individuals. Indeed, the process would not stop there. Each allocation of goods, each decision or choice that had any effect on the distribution of valued human outcomes, would be treated as an atomic act and brought under abstract rules. So, PC is not only destructive of groups, but eventually of individuals. All groups seen as interest groups. Although political correctness uses groups, it does not believe in the reality of groups. Specifically, PC acts on the basis that all human groups are merely interest groups, that is, contingent and temporary alliances held together only by cooperation in pursuit of selfish material gains. This can be seen by what are sometimes seen as apparent paradoxes or slip-ups in the application of PC policies, but which in reality reveal what PC really cares about and what it is merely using tactically. One significant illustration is that PC focuses on the moral importance of group preferences or affirmative action, yet makes no effort to define group membership. Indeed, quite the opposite. Group membership is continually being blurred and expanded. If PC was serious about group preferences, then PC would define group membership very sharply so as to exclude undeserving people from the preferences. Yet in fact, group membership is typically a matter of self-definition, and there are seldom any attempts to challenge self-definitions with evidence. Indeed, often proof that someone has made a false claim of group membership in order to obtain privileges and preferences is ignored, or the liar is actually supported emotionally, presumably because such lies reinforce the fictions of PC. For PC, group membership is simply a matter of lifestyle. For someone dishonestly to adopt the lifestyle of a favored group is in practice supportive of that politically correct moral evaluation which allocated privileged status to that group. If political correctness has been serious about the specially deserving status of their favored groups, the system would have developed strict and objective methods of group definitions and measurements. That PC has done no such thing indicates that PC does not regard group membership as truly fundamental. At a deep level, then, group identities allocated by political correctness are arbitrary to the extent that they are of peripheral concern to the system. PC merely uses groups in the game of power politics to attack, subvert, and force into submission that which it opposes, which is the historic, spontaneous state of affairs resulting in individual choice and moral autonomy. The priority, as always, is coercively to impose on society a mandatory abstract system for allocating goods. Abstract systems are always preferable to human agency because agency will certainly become corrupt, while abstract system has the potential to be perfected. Groups are merely a weapon in this fight. PC-favored groups are assumed to be weak and controllable. At present, human agency is attacked by generating various gangs, interest groups, under various banners of egalitarianism, anti-racism, anti-sexism, and all the rest. These gangs are created by PC patronage, by group preferences, group-based propaganda, laws, regulations, subsidies, exemptions, etc. The gangs function as anti-agency tactical shock troops, to be thrown against autonomous choice wherever it is identified. But because these groups have been created by PC patronage, they are not regarded as potential rulers. For PC, the anti-agency gangs are merely useful but temporary mobs. The assumption is that these mobs will disassemble and dissolve into their component parts as soon as the conduit of PC patronage is switched off. Political correctness is not, therefore, trying to install favored groups into power, and does not fear such groups becoming powerful, because PC regards them as simply as creatures of PC. Because the dominance of PC patronage gangs is unspontaneous, unnatural, unhistorical, their status is wholly artificial and utterly dependent on PC for their existence and survival. In other words, by inversion of natural, spontaneous order, political correctness ensures that favored groups are unstable, weak, and dependent. That which PC has created, PC can control. At root, PC is therefore not trying to favor certain groups as a matter of strategy. Rather, PC is tactically using one group against another group, with the strategic intent of weakening and eventually destroying all human groups. PC not fundamentally multicultural. Political correctness has become almost synonymous with favoring multiculturalism or diversity, yet this is not a core value of PC, and is indeed one of those tactical beliefs which PC adopts only as a means to an end. In PC utopia, there would be no multiculturalism. Indeed, there would be no culture at all. In other words, while political correctness does indeed hate Western culture, The hatred is only a byproduct of the fact that PC hates culture as such, since culture is an unplanned outcome of innumerable individual choices, and PC regards all individuals as irredeemably selfish and inevitably corrupt. The PC hatred of Western culture is merely a matter of using the excuse of promoting other cultures as a method of destroying culture per se. As soon as the dominant culture is destroyed and another culture has been artificially created and inserted to replace it, PC can then turn to destroying those other cultures which it created and sustains. Patronage of the new hegemony would be withdrawn, and culture displaced by abstract systems to which individual choice would be subordinated. In PC utopia there is no need for culture. People would behave properly because they had no choice. Good people would be happy about this. Bad people would, presumably, be miserable, but they would be made to do the right thing anyway. Orthodox religion is immune to PC incentives. Political correctness subverts existing social arrangements and replaces them with groups who owe their existence to PC, and does this by manipulation using material incentives, bribes, subsidies, and accolades on one hand, vilification, fines, and aggression on the other hand. But there are some groups that are immune to material incentives. Secularism made PC possible, democracy made PC irresistible, intellectual meritocracy made PC happen, and the mass media made PC pervasive. But orthodox religion will be the nemesis of PC. Atheistic political correctness simply cannot believe that there are people in the world who are motivated by religion more than by material goods. In this, PC is incurably blind. Its discourse has neither the vocabulary nor the conceptual capability to include religion. So, when there is devout, otherworldly religion that is explicitly, actively, demonstrably hostile to the values of PC, and which cannot be subverted by material incentives nor by mainstream mass media, then this phenomenon simply cannot be taken seriously by PC. Otherworldly orthodox religions will either be altogether unnoticed, or else explained away in falsely PC terms such as material needs or lifestyle preferences. But orthodox religion is buffered against materialism and lifestyle. Such religions encourage and enable people to disregard material incentives, to sacrifice this world for the next, to suffer and die for their beliefs. Orthodox religion is indeed pre-modern, was not created by PC, is not sustained by PC, does not need PC, is indeed intrinsically and impalpably opposed to PC, root and branch, and has survived vastly more opposition than PC ever would be able or willing to oppose on it. Therefore, against devoutly orthodox religion, PC is powerless. You cannot fight a foe who is advancing in the middle of your blind spot. You cannot repel a foe when your arrows bounce off the armor of faith. The only question is which religion will defeat PC in each specific place. Something to think about. PC as a Christian heresy. Since political correctness has Christian features and comes from Christian historical roots, does this mean that PC is a Christian heresy? In the sense that PC is the fault of Christianity, perhaps an inevitable outcome of Christianity? Well, yes, in a way, but actually no, not at all. Political correctness is indeed post-Christian, but the proper emphasis is on the post, not on the Christian. It is the fact that PC has rejected the core of Christianity which is of significance, not that PC retains some peripheral and fragmentary aspects of Christian ethics. Specifically, it is the rejection of the prerequisites of Christianity which caused the problem of PC. Political correctness is fundamentally, not accidentally, hostile to Christianity, basically oriented against Christianity. That is, political correctness is hostile to orthodox Christianity, Christianity as ideally conceptualized and practiced in most places and over most of the past 2,000 years. PC is not particularly hostile to the modern liberal Christianity of mainstream churches, a worldly Christianity which is liberal first and Christian only insofar as Christianity does not conflict with PC. Underlying PC there is a nihilistic rejection of reality, and this nihilism was caused when Orthodox Christianity was rejected, and nihilism was the means by which Orthodox Christianity was rejected. In order to get rid of Christianity, what was rejected was a whole way of orienting humanity in reality, most of it pagan, some of it monotheistic, a relatively small amount of it being specifically Christian. So, PC post-Christianity is not just post-Christian, but also post-monotheist and post-pagan. None of these traditional religious perspectives makes any kind of sense to PC. Politically correct post-Christianity rejects inter alia, the soul, the immaterial realm, life after death, the supernatural, e.g. angels and demons, the actuality of permanent objective reality, the possibility of knowledge of reality, the reality of the transcendental God and its components truth, beauty, and virtue, the possibility of God or gods, the possibility of divine revelation, miracles, prophecy, and so on and so on. Being post all this stuff is the very essence of PC, and the aspirations of core political correctness have nothing necessarily to do with the Christian elements currently residual in PC. Indeed, a totalitarian ideology such as political correctness, which implicitly aims at the destruction of all human agency, free will, is about as anti-Christian as it is possible to be. It would, if successfully implemented, make Christianity impossible, since belief could never be chosen. Put it like this: political correctness is always purposefully, fundamentally, and permanently anti-orthodox Christian, and only sometimes, accidentally, superficially, fragmentarily, and temporarily Christian. Western civilization cannot be saved. It is a major goal of conservative politics to save Western civilization. Yet this is not a coherent belief, nor is it possible, nor is it desirable. The big problem with saving the West is that it is precisely Western civilization which created leftism, communism, socialism, liberalism, and political correctness, bureaucracy, committees, modern art, human rights, pacifism. It is Western civilization which is destroying itself. The self-destroying aspects of the West have always been there, and they permeate or are woven into the whole. Western civilization has always been changing, not merely superficially, but deeply. It has never been stable, not even for 2 generations in a row. There is no evidence that the West could ever be stable, and everything suggests the opposite. The West is perpetually in transition. It has no essence, it is evolutionary. Those who set out their stall on defending Western civilization are therefore either defending a process, a characteristic Western evolutionary process such as market economics, democracy, science, the open society, etc., or they are defending an entity. But an evolutionary process is merely a means to an end, and might lead anywhere, including to self-destruction of Western civilization. Or else they are really defending some bottom-line entity that is not the whole of Western civilization throughout its history, and which would quite likely dispense with characteristic Western processes at some point in the future, e.g., a specific nation or group of nations, a specific race, a ruling lineage, e.g., of monarchs or castes, the preservation of which would likely necessitate discarding with what are currently considered to be Western values sooner or later. In other words, if you favor preserving a process, like democracy, sexual freedom, you must be prepared to sacrifice an entity, like nation or a race. If you favor preserving an entity, you must be prepared to dispense with processes. So, I am saying that it is strictly nonsense, and destructive nonsense, to claim to be defending Western civilization. People can only get away with this absurd claim to be defending Western civilization, get away with it in their own minds, as much as the public arena, because Western civilization is so obviously collapsing so fast, and the perception that what will become after is probably going to be miserable for most people, and because this degeneration is being accelerated by an evil, blind and insane politically correct elite who apparently must be opposed, somehow, although with little chance of short-term success. But the secular right is trying to keep its cake and eat it, to retain the residual and declining bits of modernity, the countercurrents that it personally values, especially sexual freedom, but at the same time to dispense with PC, and PC is now the mainstream and dominant flow of modernity. Because there is much to suggest that the left is indeed the main line of a Western civilization which is pre-programmed to self-destruction, while the right has been merely applying intermittent braking, imposing temporary corrections which save the West in the short term, but only at the cost of entrenching its long-term and underlying errors. If so, the West cannot be saved. To save the West would entail rewinding and recovering a pre-Western perspective and rerunning the process, hoping that this time the desired attributes would reemerge but without self-destructive leftism. But the West has self-destruction built in, or rather, Western civilization is built over a simultaneously self-dug pit of nothingness into which it will, sooner or later, fall. How can you save something which so much wants to kill itself? Take your eye off Western civilization for just a moment, and it will be swinging from the rafters with its own belt around its neck. The millennium deep roots of political correctness. The West took a turn towards legalism, logic, and bureaucracy around AD 1000, the Great Schism, when the Roman Catholic Church gradually broke away from the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church, the Byzantine Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople. Like most long-term policy mistakes, the East-West Schism was initially ritually rewarded, otherwise the mistake would not have been made, since it led to tremendous progress in the first philosophy and scholarship, especially Thomas Aquinas, with the development of universities, then later in science and technology, and later still in the economy. But schism led on to more schisms, with no end in sight. But the benefits and the mistake were alike in being built upon continuous specialization of function, progressive specialization of all functions, with limit. The Great Schism built into the thought systems of the West a fatal error, of which PC is a remote and indirect consequence. Once modernity, progressive specialization, has been built into a system, it cannot stop itself. And it cannot stop itself because continual specialization creates, or indeed itself is, continually increasing autonomy, so there is no way of one part of the system stopping another. You just get more and more specialization of function until the whole social system falls apart into useless fragments, and all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty together again. By secularizing knowledge, by creating the university, by making philosophy autonomous of the church instead of having learning institutionally focused in monasteries, the West eventually made political correctness, which is now everywhere and inescapable. And PC is the West's nemesis, because the West cannot decisively overturn PC without overturning that which made it the West. The West cannot overcome PC without ceasing to be the West. Yet, if this overturning of PC does not happen, then the West will itself be subverted by PC. In other words, the West is built upon error. Its strength is also its weakness. Its power is also that which is self-destroying. Even as the West built its great structures, it was simultaneously gnawing at their foundations. Here is the double bind. To be anti-PC is to be anti the West, always in tendency, albeit not by intention. Yet at the same time, to be pro-PC is to be anti the West, always in tendency, also by intention. And /so/but the West was never sustainable. Looking back, the West was a blip on the graph of history, albeit a 1,000-year blip, with the hundreds-of-year-long gradual uptick in the rapid decades-long collapse looming ever closer. Just so soon as the West began to implement its assumptions towards completion, which is political correctness, just so soon the West began actively, as well as passively, to destroy itself. Could resurgent nationalism save Western civilization from PC? After secularization eroded religious cohesion in modernizing societies from the 1700s, there was an era of secular nationalism in developed countries. And some opponents of PC see resurgent secular nationalism as an antidote to the cultural decline caused by political correctness. Accepting that political correctness is cultural suicide, and leaving aside the question of whether or not it would be beneficial, is it likely that resurgent secular nationalism can unify the right and could reverse the cultural suicide of PC? Nationalism is indeed a powerful unifier and motivator, perhaps the most powerful form of secular cohesion, because nationalism has potential to bring together all classes, both sexes, young and old, sometimes even several ethnicities and religions. But a secular nationalism would nowadays have a strongly different character for most secular nationalisms of the past. A modern nationalism might perhaps save the nation, probably at the cost of fracturing it into smaller nations, but it would not save the national culture. Furthermore, secular nationalisms of past seem to have had little staying power, fading within only 2 or 3 generations. So nationalism would be, at best, a band-aid. But is it even that? When secular nationalism was an effective political force, e.g. from the 19th up to mid-20th centuries in the West, it was a movement which grew spontaneously. It did not need much encouragement. Furthermore, in most countries, perhaps all of them, nationalism originated with the intellectual elites, typically the lower ranks of the elites, i.e. the most numerous ranks of the ruling class, people like school teachers and lower-level administrators, also journalists and artists. This even applies to Germany. Nationalism had been going on for more than a century among the Dichter und Denker, poets and thinkers, before it was rather suddenly hijacked by the mostly lower-class National Socialists reacting against international communism. In other words, past successful nationalisms were led by a cultural elite. Nationalism was a political movement of clerks, and therefore, even before it got going, old-style nationalism already controlled the media and mass communications. Past successful nationalisms therefore originated with exactly those groups which are nowadays the most politically correct, least nationalistic, most in favor of multiculturalism. But modern nationalists are precisely excluded from the mass media. Any modern nationalism would therefore need to be very different from past nationalisms. Of course, new things can happen, and we are, after all, in an unprecedented situation, i.e., the new experience of deliberate, strategic, sustained, cultural and biological suicide by the intellectual elites, taking their nations and cultures with them. Perhaps such a novel situation will inevitably lead to unforeseen types of political response, perhaps including a nationalism which is opposed to the exact groups which, in previous nationalisms, supported it. In line with this, what does seem to be resurgent in the West, to some extent, maybe limited, is a lower-class, populist nationalism. What we are seeing is a nationalism led by the skilled working class rather than the teachers, lower civil servants, and writers. We are seeing a nationalism of tradesmen rather than clerks. However, to be successful against PC, when PC is sustained by an intellectual ruling class and the mass media, such a nationalism of the tradesmen would surely need both be anti-intellectual and impose tight control over the mass media. A resurgent secular nationalism would therefore seek to replace the effete, the irrelevant, decadent clerks with its sensible, skilled workers. And since a new nationalism of tradesmen lacks access to the media and mass communications, and also lacks the skill to use them, it would be impalpably opposed by the media and mass communications systems. Anti-PC resurgent secular nationalism would therefore naturally be anti the media and mass communications, as well as anti their personnel. A nationalism of the upper working class/lower middle class would necessarily promote a radically simplified, popular and accessible folk culture, suitable for those who are only secondarily concerned with culture as a leisure time activity or as a means to other ends. Tradesmen class leaders are likely to regard high culture with hostility, based on the suspicion, often accurate, although, importantly, not entirely so, that high culture is a tool for forcing the tradesman class into subordinate status for elevating the status of the clerks. In such a society, warrior virtues would presumably predominate: courage, decisiveness, loyalty, perhaps common sense and concrete effectiveness, and there would consequently be only relatively few high-status ruling positions for intellectuals, high artists, and abstract thinkers. In a tradesman-led nationalism, intellectuals would, rather, be allocated to subordinate status as functionaries. Recall that historically, and still in most of the world, aside from relatively few senior priests, the bulk of intellectuals were of modest and circumscribed status, such as clerks, teachers, servants, slaves, outcasts, itinerants, eunuchs, and celibates. Characteristics of a new secular nationalism. Since the modern elite or officer class is truly, madly, deeply politically correct, if a nationalism were to arise, which seems unlikely, it would need to originate from and be led by the tradesman class, or, to put it another way, the non-commissioned officer class, NCO. That is to say, a nationalism led by the sergeants and corporals and not by the majors and captains. All else being equal, Under normal circumstances, an army led by officers will be much more effective than an army led by NCOs. But, it could be argued, these are not normal circumstances. The modern situation in the West resembles that of a city under siege. The city is threatened by an expanding parasite class, sturdy beggars, or the undeserving poor, as G.B. Shaw termed them, by riots within and by the enemy without. However, the officers have become decadent. The officers find uncouth, are bored by, scared of, and have indeed come to loathe the NCOs and squaddies of their own city. Noblesse oblige is a thing of the past, and socialism has long since rejected its working-class roots in favor of a rainbow coalition of parasitic, underclass, and designated victim groups. Periodically, groups of indigents approach the besieged city gates. Some are hopeless cases, displaced peasants from the surrounding area, some are shrewd merchants and traders from here and there, keen to work hard and make some money, some are petty criminals, others are not so petty criminals, gangsters and assorted thugs, thieves and beggars. And some of the indigents at the gate are of enemy fifth columnists, who intend at some point in the future to inflict violence and mayhem to aid the besiegers and take over the city. But whoever the indigents are, and whatever their intention, the officers invariably feel sorry for them, sorrier than they do for their own NCOs and squaddies, or for the indigenes of the city, and so always let them all come through the gates and into the city, because to do otherwise would to be commit the ultimate and unforgivable sin of discrimination, and direct the NCOs to make sure the new arrivals are well taken care of, by allocating them a generous share of the NCOs and squaddies' rations and living quarters. And within the city's own indigenous populations are large mobs of sturdy vagrants who are either too feckless to be of any use, or simply refuse to help with the defense of the walls, the parasitic sturdy beggars and underclass. These muggers, robbers, beggars, and barflies roam around fighting, having parties, and looting. The NCOs are not exactly forbidden to intervene, but will be harshly punished if they transgress any of the very strict and continually changing rules of engagement. So the underclass are left alone to do their business. On orders from the officers, the sturdy vagrants receive a daily dole of bread and beer, also taken from the NCO and squaddies' supplies. This situation of the officers robbing the NCOs and squaddies to reward outsiders and vagrants is roughly, and in purely materialistic sense, which leaves out the vital and spiritual and religious dimension, the situation of the modern West. Secular nationalism is, at minimum, an attempt to make effective the defense of the city, first to stop admitting, then to expel outsiders, fifth columnists and parasites, to suppress internal disorder. But the officers will not do this, and will need to try to prevent it. So, if the city has not fallen first, and that is a big if, then at some point, perhaps, there may be an NCO mutiny, and the army will be taken over and run by the senior sergeants. Because a city will be better defended by an army led by loyal NCOs than by an army led by traitorous officers. If this kind of secular nationalism happens at a reaction against the treason of the clerks, then it would surely, necessarily, be accompanied by a powerful anti-officer campaign, during which officers would be purged from all significant positions of leadership and replaced by sergeants. The outcome would be a pretty shambolic army or society. Yet, it would not have to be well organized, only well enough organized to defeat the forces which oppose it. If nothing else happens first, at some point in the cultural decline that is political correctness, the point will be passed at which nationalist NCO-led army will be more effective than the army led by anti-nationalist officers. Yet before this happens, it may well be that the city will fall to the enemy, and instead of being run by an NCO army of the indigenous population, the city will instead be taken over by an officer-led army of invaders. Could a party of common sense replace political correctness? With the profound weakness of mainstream Christianity in the West, due to subversion by leftism and subordination to PC, and with the weakness of old-style nationalism, led by the lower levels of the upper class, teachers, minor civil servants, and journalists, who are now the most zealous of the politically correct, and with the unlikeliness of a new nationalism of the tradesman/NCO class, then the most likely opposition to political correctness, especially in the USA, currently comes from the populist, reactionary, secular groups based on common sense. From a Christian perspective, such groupings are seriously suboptimal, at best a temporary expedient. Nonetheless, supposing that common sense secularism was actually to be powerful, what then? Would it provide a better alternative future than PC? What would the future be? This can be predicted by considering the probable characteristics of such a grouping and weighing up the pros and cons. Since so much of Western society is now corrupted by liberalism and implicated in PC, such a group would have to come from outside this, and in rejecting the psychotic delusionality of PC, it would need to offer a common-sense alternative, which would be obvious to plain, middling, productive people out with the intelligentsia and their underclass of state dependence. And since a common-sense party would be reactive against PC, we can infer its main features. Here's a non-exhaustive list, in no particular order, of characteristics of a possible common-sense CS party, contrasted with the politically correct PC party. CS versus PC. Natural and spontaneous versus human-designed. Reality is real and fixed versus reality is relative and plastic. Coercive force versus propaganda. Face-to-face versus mass media. Concrete versus abstract. Immediate versus utopian. Instinctive versus educated, native versus immigrant, popular culture versus high art, practical versus theoretical, invention versus science, white versus non-white, hereditary versus culture, apprenticeship versus formal education, men versus women, recognition versus certification, selfish versus altruistic, personal authority versus bureaucratic procedure, heterosexual versus homosexual, heart versus head, gut versus intellect, national versus international, tribal versus outcast, family versus universalist, real versus ideal, morality versus law, natural law versus moral inversion, courage versus tolerance, loyalty versus subversion, useful versus useless, duty versus self-development, productive versus ideologically sound, money grubbing versus parasitic, responsibilities versus rights, charity versus needs, hierarchy versus egalitarianism. This list suggests that secular modern politics boils down either to political correctness or what could be, and almost certainly would be, termed a kind of fascism. In other words, fascism is approximately what you get when political correctness is opposed with common sense. Of course, the left have been calling the right fascist since the mid-1960s. I am suggesting that in doing this, the left are broadly correct. However, there are two important qualifications. One, that the fascist label properly applies only to the secular right, not to the religious right. And two, fascism is not synonymous with the Nazis, who are substantially a socialist and leftist party, as the name of National Socialism implies. Maybe at some point the secular right will eventually stop fighting the fascist label and become openly and explicitly fascist, but distancing themselves from the National Socialist type of semi-fascism. The religious right is not fascist. Fascism is secular, hence modern, and the religious right is pre-modern and much more ancient than fascism. Indeed, the religious right was pretty much all there was in pre-modern times, conflict being between different varieties of religious right. The huge difference between religious right and secular right is that the religious right seeks to rule society primarily by religious principles, by religious goals. By contrast, the common-sense secular right, fascism, is justified on the basis of this worldly common-sense goals, such as the aim to make its supporters happier and richer, to provide a glorious national or ethnic purpose, to forge a new community of the heart. What is the good? The good is the highest goal in life, but the good as a unitary entity is hard to understand and to think about, and most people usually focus on three component transcendental goods of truth, beauty, and virtue, moral good. However, there is a problem in splitting up the good, which is that people begin to evaluate the world using separate modalities of thought. Truth becomes the province of first philosophy, then later science. Beauty becomes the province of art. And virtue? Virtue becomes religion, the whole thing. Then later virtue becomes a secular ideology. Yes, indeed, virtue, or morality, can become the whole of a religion, such that people cannot see that religion has anything to do with either truth or beauty. Morality becomes the whole thing, the sole legitimate aim of human endeavor, in which circumstance religion becomes legalistic inevitably. Virtue is then a matter of following a set of rules, of laws. Virtue is reduced merely to obedience. But once religion is reduced to the pursuit of virtue, and once virtue is conceptualized in terms of laws and obedience to these laws, then secular morality can dispense with religion. So now we observe that morals and ethics seem to be autonomous from religion, forming an apparently autonomous realm of discourse, circular, mutually reinforcing without foundation outside of persons, referenced solely by the subjective states of persons as operationalized in public proxy measures. And this free-floating, continually changing secular morality is then turned around to use to judge and evaluate the virtuousness of those systems of religion from which it originated, which provided its original foundations, and finds religion deficient. The pursuit of virtue, detached from its unity with truth and beauty in the good, is therefore a major pathology of Western thought. Some Christian denominations, indeed most of them, are wholly concerned with virtue and regard truth, and especially beauty, as of grossly subordinate importance. The actual circumstances of this kind of religious life and practice may indeed be devoid of beauty or hostile to beauty. Indeed, beauty may be regarded as a snare rather than a component of the good. And the same applies to mainstream secular ideologies, such as communism or modern liberal political correctness. These are wholly virtue-oriented. Untruthfulness in pursuit of virtue is not only tolerated, but positively approved. Destroying beauty and creating ugliness in pursuit of virtue is similarly valued as evidence of moral seriousness. Truthfulness is seen as pedantic and selfish, a passionate concern for beauty as trivial, a species of self-indulgent upper-class dandyism. For the zealously politically correct, the most virtuous ought to be indifferent to such matters as truth and beauty. Noble minds should be wholly moral. But lined up against this partial pursuit of virtue are similarly absurd, wicked, and evil partial exaltations of truth and beauty, and these are also characteristics of modernity. The partial pursuit of truth leads to scientism, to the common and indeed dominating conviction that science, mathematics, and the like are the only valid forms of knowledge, and that the true and dedicated scientist should pursue truth indifferent to virtue and beauty, on the basis that the single-minded pursuit of truth is intrinsically virtuous and necessarily beautiful. The equivalent situation in the arts can be seen when beauty becomes the exclusive province of specialized art for art professionals, aesthetics become distinct from the evaluations of virtue and truth, and the ideal is art for art's sake. So we have long since reached, a situation when the transcendental goods have been split up and regarded as separable, regarded as amenable to separate pursuit, are indeed contrasted with each other and pitted against each other by what they are de facto interest groups such as priests, scientists, and artists, each claiming the high ground, each trying to subordinate the others. Yet the good is in reality a unity. That which is good is intrinsically and inevitably virtuous, true, and beautiful. Truth, beauty, and virtue cannot really be separated. The good is not attained by being virtuous and then bolting on truth and adding a layer of beauty, nor is it attained by a narrowly fanatical pursuit of precision and reliability, then surrounding it with a halo of words that claim its ultimate virtuousness and an assertion of its special kind of beauty, nor by a belief that a novel, poem, painting, song, created to fulfill the criteria of these aesthetic forms, is intrinsically also an agent of the highest truth and tending to a special kind of human virtue. For a Christian to aim at the good is it to regard it as a characteristic of God, and to conceptualize the aim of life as the intention mystically to move towards communion with God, to become more God-like. The situation is that the true, beautiful, and moral are merely aspects of the good, and when they are not aspects of that unity, then they are not good. The discrete pursuit of truth, beauty, and virtue, as if they were distinct goals, tends therefore to become a subversive of the good, and may indeed become its opposite, have indeed already and long since become the opposite of good. For political correctness to act as if virtue is higher than truth and beauty is therefore very swiftly to embrace that which opposes the good, not merely the narrowly wicked anti-virtuous idea of bad, but further to destroy the whole capacity for good. Political correctness is purposefully subversive to the good. PC is not ignorant of the good, it knows what is the good. PC must indeed know enough about the good that it may subvert it. And indeed, knowledge of the good is built into humans. This is termed natural law. The point of PC is that it systematically subverts virtue, beauty, and truth and pursues wickedness, ugliness, and lies, and not by accident, not merely by ignorance nor by selfish short-termism, but as a matter of the highest principle. In morality, PC pursues the opposite of virtue. It learns about spontaneous human morality, natural law, and it does something else. Political correctness subverts the natural and spontaneous. It reacts against it. In practice, it does the opposite, or what it conceives to be the opposite. PC inverts. Where humans are motivated by love or duty, PC demands that they be motivated by adherence to formal principles and procedures. Where humans spontaneously nurture and protect the family, PC attacks the family relentlessly and promotes any and all forms of social organization except the family. Because humans, like all animals, are heterosexual, PC promotes all other forms of sexuality. Because some humans are brave and heroic, and those who are not tend to admire these traits, PC promotes careerism and expediency. Because humans naturally love beauty and value those who create beauty, therefore PC subverts beauty and aggressively promotes dysphoric stimuli. Politically correct art is anti-beauty. It regards the beautiful as kitsch at best and tyrannically fascist at worst. It is about creating expectations then thwarting them. It is about replacing harmony with dissonance, edification with shock, delight with horror, pleasing sounds with noise, elevating subjects with disgusting subjects, aesthetic elevation with visceral degradation. And PC reacts against the truth. Truth is to be subordinated to the goal of subversion. Unwanted truths are hate facts. Universally known truths are replaced with narrow scraps of bureaucratically defined principles. Spontaneous and obvious knowledge is contested, undermined, broken up, and contradicted one fragment at a time and replaced with professional consensus, peer review. What does PC put in the place of the good and its component transcendentals of virtue, beauty, and truth? Nothing definite, because for PC there is no reality. Instead, there are infinite number of relative realities. PC subverts the good, but offers no substitute for the good, except the better. The good versus the better. PC does not know what it aims for. It only knows that it must destroy the good, that it may be replaced by something better. Only it has no criteria for evaluating what is better than good, only that the better be different from what is. Since evaluations are themselves relative for PC, the better can never really be known to be better than the good, but the belief is that the earthly good is certainly not perfect, and by its change it might become better. PC therefore subverts the good and seeks the better, in belief or hope that the better will emerge as a consequence of the evolving process. If PC has any faith, which is doubtful, it is that this evolutionary process of subversion and experiment is intrinsically virtuous. This is how it works. Current and past realities always have specific flaws when compared with an ideal. Some of these specific flaws of reality loom very large to moderns, such as that all human societies before 1800 accepted slavery. Since there are an infinite number of imaginable alternative realities which have all the desirable attributes of real history but lack these specific flaws, it follows that there must be many potential realities, among some which must be better than any current or past reality. The job of PC is then to destroy current reality, detach itself from all past realities, and seek among the infinity of an alternative for something better, which must, surely, be there by sheer mathematical probability. PC will sort through, experiment with these alternative realities to find something better, maybe something perfect. Anyone who opposes this virtuous process of search and experiment is regarded simply as an apologist for the specific evils of the present and the past. To prefer the past is to prefer slavery. When PC subverts the good, instead promotes vice, lies, and ugliness, this is self-perceived as merely humble experiments in pursuit of the better. Can the desire to end suffering be the primary motivation? The most frequently expressed leftist political goal is to end human suffering in the world, or at least minimize it. This carries force, since we are creatures of this world, as well as being motivated by a desire to attain pleasure we want even more to escape suffering, and empathically to relieve suffering, which makes us suffer too. So long as we perceive suffering in the world, even if that suffering is just insufficient pleasure or mere boredom, then we will be motivated to some extent to end it. Indeed, we are motivated to some extent to end suffering everywhere and for everyone for all time, simply as a matter of security. Because so long as suffering happens somewhere to someone, or may do so in future, then it could happen to us. But if there is no more suffering at all, then we need never fear it, whatever happens. But suppose, as a thought experiment, that all suffering has indeed been ended, at least so far as we know. What then? Do we imagine that when all suffering has been ended, then we will shift our aspiration to higher things? Or that only when all suffering has been ended ought we shift our aspirations to higher things? Do we really think that is what did and should and would happen? Is this, in fact, what we observe? Are the societies that suffer least those which aspire the highest? Are those historic societies which attain the highest levels of holiness also those societies where life was most comfortable? Are those individuals who are freest from suffering also those individuals who have their sights set on the highest ideals? Do we, in a word, conceive high ideals as luxury goods? Or could it be that high ideals are, in some way or another, a product of suffering, or, if not exactly suffering, a state of discontent? Yes, that is correct, isn't it? It is our suffering that prompts us to look beyond the mundane. Prompts us, but does not force us. Is suffering then good? Obviously not. As worldly creatures we are, and must be, motivated to escape suffering in some sense. But suffering is, if not good, surely necessary or at least inevitable in this world. And, surely, a primary devotion to the elimination of suffering, i.e., the new religion, the new Christianity indeed, is therefore not merely utopian or futile, but is actually evil, is indeed actually a covert death wish, death being, for atheists, the only sure end to suffering, and perhaps a deep cause of the anti-life malaise that's so characteristic of political correctness. The world is not enough. We just are creatures who perceive the world as insufficient, and the only way we can get rid of this perception is to kill it. Yet we cannot make the world sufficient, we can only destroy the perception that the world is insufficient. But we can do that, for most of the people, for most of the time. And that is, of course, precisely what we are doing. Indeed, although we are, and must be, and should not try not to be, creatures of this world, a primary devotion directed at anything of this world, including the elimination of suffering, is evil. Our primary devotion should be to the good, the transcendental good, a something not of this world. Or else we, and everyone else, might as well be dead already, or even better, never live in the first place, as the surest means of avoiding suffering. Just as we put down a suffering animal, whom we oppose not to have a soul, and whose role is to serve humans and/or be happy, and if the animal can no longer serve humans nor be happy and is suffering, then it might as well be dead. So we kill it. And logically, to eliminate suffering, we also ought to kill anything else we suppose not to have a soul, from humane motives. If suffering is regarded as the worst evil, and if death is extinction, as soul-denying PC believes, then universal death is logically the greatest good. An end to all conscious life, including suicide, is then the only sure ethical policy. Political correctness believes that humans, like animals, lack a soul, and believes that death is an end to consciousness. PC also believes that suffering is the worst evil. That combination should worry you. Can't we simply subtract PC from modernity? Political correctness is generally talked of as a factor in modern society, but it is primarily a spiritual malaise. PC is not so much a factor as simply the entire worldview of mainstream modern Western intellectuals, left, right, and center. Since PC is pervasive, whatever the future holds, one future we cannot have, even if we really wanted it and tried to get it, which we don't and aren't, is to have modern society without political correctness. We cannot have the stuff which makes modern life so stimulating and comfortable minus PC. Yet of course, on the other hand, we cannot have the stuff which makes modern life so stimulating and comfortable with PC, because PC is both actively and passively destroying all of these. So, we are going to lose modern society whatever happens, whether PC continues and destroys these things, or whether PC is itself destroyed and replaced. From the stimulation and comfort perspective, it is a lose-lose situation. Lack of common sense will be the end of PC. Yet political correctness cannot save itself with a dose of common sense, because PC cannot yield an inch in the direction of common sense. Since from where PC has landed us, common sense will take us directly to something very like fascism, something which is utterly opposed, and not by accident, to everything which PC stands for, including a life dedicated to stimulation and comfort. And we cannot go back to any point earlier in modernity, since these were merely transitional eras when PC had not quite broken through to dominance, but it was there, and all trends were set for it to take over. It would be futile to try, but we cannot even try, because there are no grounds for leverage. That is, to exert pressure for change, we would need to get outside PC sufficiently to exert leverage against PC. Yet so long as we remain within Western modernity, we are still within PC and not outside of it. There is nowhere from which to operate a lever. PC and original sin. The special quality of PC, compared with secular right-wing politics, is that it retains from earlier religious cultural stages a core belief in what might be termed a secular version of original sin, the ultimate selfishness and inevitable corruptibility of human beings, and feels intense guilt for this, and this guilt cannot be divinely forgiven, so propitiation must be made within this world. So, whereas communism believed that human beings were perfectible, since the perfect society would, according to communism, yield perfect humans who made virtuous choices without coercion, PC by contrast believes that humans are necessarily selfish and corruptible, that humans cannot be trusted ever. Humans will always tend to choose selfishly. And therefore, for PC, the perfect society must be structured such that human choice is eliminated. This insight into the sinfulness of human nature is the source from which political correctness draws its ideological strength, because the insight that humans are necessarily selfish and corruptible is indeed true. Therefore, political correctness is based upon a deeper perception of reality than its secular right opponents, who often try to argue that humans are not all that bad, or not all of them anyway. Well, actually, humans are that bad. But that is not the end of the matter. The big question is not to quibble over the spontaneously recognized fact that humans are fundamentally sinful, but what are the implications of the fact? That humans are sinful, and that there is something fundamentally wrong with us, and that we ought rightly to feel guilt, have been truisms of religious insight for as long as we have records. There is therefore nothing new about PC regarding humans as sinful and guilty. That is not a novelty of PC in any way, shape, or form. But what is new about PC is what to do about original sin. Faith in abstract systems. What is new about PC is the response to perceiving the sinfulness of humans. The only solution to intrinsic human sin and guilt is faith in the reality of non-human salvation. Traditional religion, perceiving humanity to be sinful, located goodness in the non-material, transcendental, or supernatural world, so that in Christianity, virtue was located in God. But for PC, there is neither God nor anything existing outside either the meaningless material realm and the sinful realm of human subjectivity. Therefore, PC locates moral virtue in a non-human and also non-material realm, the realm of abstract system. Here is an important difference between the majority of unreflective, careerist, and opportunistic PC drones and the inner elite of self-aware, moral, and devoutly PC. The careerist PC masses locate sin in right-wingers, but the devout PC elite recognize the sinfulness of all humans. The careerist PC masses seek a solution in replacing rulership of the sinful right with rulership of the virtuous left. But the devout PC elites seek a solution not in replacing one gang of sinful humans with another gang, who are ultimately just as bad, but in replacing all human agency in all circumstances with abstract systems, even their own agency. The sincerely and truly PC seek to subordinate everything, including themselves, to abstract systems. The replacement for individual agency is currently almost always one form of systemic formal bureaucracy or another: committee decision, peer review, voting, algorithms, flowcharts, protocols, guidelines, quotas. Tactically, it doesn't really matter which of these, or others, are implemented because all are more abstract and less personal than individual agency. For the PC, these are all a step in the right direction. Since formal bureaucracy is all-pervasive and authoritative in Western modernity, So is political correctness all-pervasive and authoritative. PC may be weird, irrational, suicidal to common sense, but PC is mainstream, even in its extremes. Mainstream modern public discourse is therefore politically correct. Mainstream discussion occurs only and always between degrees of political correctness, between the more PC and less PC, between avant-garde and traditional PC, but all public discourse is PC. The mainstream secular right is therefore always, fundamentally and necessarily politically correct. For example, the secular right locates virtue not in individuals but in abstract systems, competition, the market, the outcome of the open society, the Constitution, etc. The disagreement between the libertarian right and the liberal left is merely a minor quibble over what kind of abstract system is preferable and how it is to be implemented. We are all politically correct now. This is why PC cannot be defeated by any existing strand of public discourse. All influential public discourse, right and left, is fundamentally PC in its assumptions, and differs only in degree. This is why there is no possibility of deconverting the PC elite. There is nobody to deconvert them. And the PC elites will resist any common sense reforms as tending towards fascism, and they would be correct in inferring this tendency. PC can only be replaced, not reformed. Why don't you convert to political correctness? Since you can't do anything about political correctness, why not just make the best of it? Why not exploit the situation instead of moaning about it? Do what is expedient. Why not? Why not make a successful career out of PC like so many others? Why not surrender your private mind to PC in the same way as you have already surrendered your public behavior? By having any reservations at all, you are making yourself miserable. Why not simply cast aside those reservations? Just say an inner yes to what you will, anyway, be forced to do. Since you necessarily inhabit the thought prison that is political correctness, then why not, at least, become one of the trustees among the inmates, to assist with the smooth running of the jail, and to get yourself a few privileges? Why not, indeed, strive to become one of the guards? Somebody has to do the job. Maybe you could temper the severity of the regime. And herein lies the particular temptation for the intellectual elite, a temptation few resist. That, literally, soul-destroying pragmatism by which, for eminently sensible reasons, we quietly, by gradual degrees, change sides in the spiritual battle of the world, that unseen warfare between the good and that which opposes the good. Well, why not? There is no earthly reason why not. In a world of pervasive and powerful PC, there is really only one compelling reason for holding back and resisting in any way, shape, or form, which is that embracing political correctness will shrink your soul. If you do not believe in the soul, this reason will carry no force at all. So by your own calculations, you are stupid to resist PC. Or, if you believe the soul is inviolable, and that nothing you think or do can affect the soul, then also, by your own calculations, you are stupid to resist PC. If you do not believe in natural law, innate knowledge of the good, and that breaking natural law harms the soul, then logically you should learn to love PC. If you do not believe in the reality of transcendental good, then you might as well go with the flow, allow yourselves to be reprogrammed, to learn, by regular practice, to relabel lies as truth, ugliness as beauty, evil as virtue, until PC has entered your heart and soul, as well as pouring into your ears and out from your mouth. But political correctness is nihilism, therefore it is not merely political, it is also existential. To fight against political correctness is therefore ultimately an existential act, a battle to preserve the eternal soul. But if you do not believe that political correctness will harm your eternal soul, then you would be well advised to suck it up. Why not? How to be non-PC. To be non-PC, you need to be cut off from the mainstream. At the least, you need to make sacrifices, specifically to forego aspirations towards mainstream power and status, and then, unless embedded in a traditional Orthodox religious society, and then you won't be reading these words, you will be more or less on your own. To be non-PC is not, therefore, a matter of building a political movement. It is a matter of personal salvation, done because you ought to do it, not with the hope of changing the world by worldly methods. Hence to reject PC is fraught with its own hazards, of going off the rails due to lack of external guidance, of falling into self-conceit, arrogance, and the sin of spiritual pride. However, lacking any non-PC support network, there is not really any alternative for most people to going solo. So, how to reject PC, lacking public support, and indeed in the face of almost monolithically hostile pro-PC discourse and a worldview based upon deep premises which cannot be challenged but which lead inexorably to PC? Some of the answer is simple. 1. Negatively, a mixture of avoiding, as much as possible, participation in the mass media, and avoiding, as much as possible, the discourse of high-level modern bureaucracy, and 2. Positively, an immersion, as much as possible, in traditional non-PC discourse, which will necessarily mostly be written, and from the historical sources, and from an orthodox religious perspective. And that's it. Except, of course, that tradition is born not by the written word, but by its interpretation, therefore by humans. On that basis, we haven't got a chance, since the thread of tradition has been broken, and there are no, or almost no, wise and adept non-PC spiritual advisors. But then there is the hope for external help, from outside of the human world, by praying for the grace to understand and the strength to choose. Ultimately, that is what we must rely upon. However, if you personally don't believe in the possibility of external help, then I'm afraid you have no legitimate grounds for hope. But you will instead simply have to hope for hope.